Hello, welcome to ERM Advantage. I'm Eric Holmquist. Here we talk about best practices in enterprise risk management, those that lead to creating real business value. Now, in our first two videos, we talked about what I see as challenges in how organizations approach ERM, and then some high-level thoughts on solutions to some of those problems. If you'd like to go back and look at those videos first, you can get there through this link. Now, for this third in the series, we're now going to talk about the ERM framework overall before moving on to each of the individual framework components. This will give us a good foundation for everything else that we're going to talk about in the weeks and months to come. Let's go. So let's start to think about what a next generation ERM framework looks like, building on the principles and themes we've been talking about. These will be relatively broad brushstroke elements. We'll continue to drill deeper and deeper as we go along. Let's start by reiterating the definitions that we provided in the very first video. First off, risk, the uncertainty of outcomes while in pursuit of our strategic objectives. Then risk management being the systems, methods, and processes designed to identify, measure, control, and monitor risks to ensure that everything from strategy to operations is aligned with stated risk appetite levels, appropriately balancing risk and return. Again, the idea here is that we're not managing to no risk or just minimizing risk, we're managing to specific tolerance thresholds. And then finally, enterprise risk management, just the extension of that, ensuring we have a structure for consistently managing risk across the entire organization on an integrated basis. Now, these will serve as important framing principles for everything else we're going to talk about. So next, let's take a look at our governance framework. Now, as we think about strong ERM, there are a few elements that are really still conceptually sound, where other elements really are due for some dramatic change. From the highest level, the traditional risk management life cycle, or some variation on this theme, still kind of makes sense. The idea that we start with the identification of risks, some process for assessing, interpreting that risk, deciding what level of controls to put in place, and then managing, mitigating risk as we go, an ongoing monitoring process, a related reporting element, which then loops back to continued identification. Now, the idea represents an ongoing cycle of evaluation, managing, and monitoring that ensures perpetual improvement in the identification and mitigation of risks. This isn't a concept that risk managers invented, rather adopted from centuries of sound operational management regardless of the industry. Similarly, the basic governance structure of a three lines model, while oft criticized or questioned, is still a fundamentally sound approach. The idea is of having a first line, business units in their respective support areas, who own the risk. The second line that is there to ensure a sound risk framework and provide effective challenge. And the third line providing control attestation. This combined with a balance of the board and management risk committees completes the final governance layer to ensure program support, visibility, and a path for issue escalation. Now, I've heard a variety of suggestions on potential changes to this model, but frankly, just none that seem compelling. I have yet to see a plausible alternative that I felt didn't create more problems than it solves. So while I'm very open to other ideas, I still see this as a perfectly reasonable and effective governance model. Now, this model is a base, and it can be customized or modified in certain ways to accommodate larger or smaller institutions, but the fundamental concepts remain. Now, we'll talk more about the three lines, as well as a whole video dedicated to the role of the board, as well as risk committees later on. As is always the case, the key to success in any governance structure is to ensure that roles are clearly defined, enforced, and respected. Any ambiguity in roles and responsibilities will have significant consequences in the program's overall effectiveness. And the final element of our overall governance model is one I refer to as the three-legged stool of risk management. Now, you're going to find that I'm a particular fan of metaphors, mainly because they help communicate ideas in ways that people just relate to. Now, the first leg is a well-defined strategy. One clearly articulates a future state and the goals and objectives designed to achieve that future state. A strategy that is achieved through consensus and is fully aligned with the mission, vision, culture, and risk appetite of the board and senior management, and one that is communicated to the people that are responsible for achieving that strategy. The second is a clear risk appetite framework, which defines an overarching risk philosophy along with quantifiable metrics and limits that establish specific tolerances for risk-taking. One that is also fully aligned with the mission, vision, culture, and strategy of the board and senior management. And as I've described in every article, presentation, or training session I've ever given, these two comprise the guardrails for any business. Everything that the institution does should happen within these two guardrails. Anything outside of them is going to be a problem. Then the final leg is a comprehensive enterprise risk assessment, one that can help the institution clearly determine whether everything is operating within those guardrails, from the strategy itself to the operations designed to achieve that strategy. Now, what's important about this component is that it's the bridge between our overall governance model and the framework elements themselves. In fact, in my mind, it's these three elements that are the most critical, most central to effective risk management. Many of our program elements can be immature and mature as we go. But if you don't have these three elements, then you really don't have a risk management program. Everything in enterprise risk management rests on these three elements. And if they don't align, the tool, again sticking with the metaphor, will never hold weight. It is therefore the first mission of enterprise risk management to ensure that these core elements exist, are well understood, and are aligned in board and management acceptance relative to the story that they tell about acceptable risk. Any inconsistency or incongruency between these three must be resolved if the institution is serious about mature risk management. Now, taken along with the concept of the risk management life cycle and the three lines of defense model, this really rounds out our foundation of key governing elements and gives us a very solid foundation on which to build. From here, we can now move to some of the design aspects of the components of the ERM framework and program, and it is here where change is desperately needed. So as we stated earlier, utilizing a variety of risk types as core dimensions for a framework and program has always been problematic. Again, no risk is characterized by only one traditional risk type, but many. This is quite literally like trying to pull one ingredient out of a cake after it's already been baked, and then getting frustrated as to why we can't. If we're going to design a practical framework to effectively manage risk, then we need to start with a program and a perspective as to how the business is actually constructed. Going back to what I introduced in the last video, that structure and a foundation for where all risk exists includes just three dimensions. Number one, strategic. These are fundamentally design risks and focus on the strength of the design of key areas such as the strategic plan, governance, policies, core programs, etc. If the design of any of these is flawed, in other words, introduces risk, then execution becomes almost irrelevant. However, because these involve design consideration, risk factors are largely within our control. These risks are generally evaluated based on our underlying assumptions and the related confidence in those assumptions. For simplicity, this category could also be simply referred to as design if desired. Next is the environmental. This takes into consideration a variety of external influences, which is distinctly different than external events, which are operational. This includes the economy, competition, regulatory demand, geopolitical trends, the environmental, etc. For these factors, the focus becomes more about our understanding of these influences and our related assumptions about how we are prepared to either exploit or defend against them over time. And finally, operational. The operational process is designed to implement our strategy, which then relates to the contemporary definition of operational risk, the potential for losses associated with failed people, process, technology, or external events. Now, this is fairly familiar territory where the risks are assessed with a focus on underlying processes, although there's a lot we're going to talk about there, how we can improve that process as well. Again, if we're trying to get to a place of more simplicity, it would be hard to argue any conceivable risk that doesn't fall into one of these three buckets: bad design, bad execution, or some external influence. Therefore, this gives us an excellent place to start. The first two, strategic and external, we refer to as macro risk areas, since they affect the entire institution or industry rather than just one area. Now, in a sense, we could choose to refer to that portion as constituting the enterprise risks, and the third being the operational risks. However, I find it's better just to consider this all part of an enterprise risk assessment, just with two components, macro risks and operational, for reasons we'll cover later. But again, the macro risks are assessed based on our assumptions about the related design, and then the operational risks are addressed in the more familiar way of looking at the underlying processes and the related risks and risk treatments. Now, before moving on, it's also worth briefly noting that there are some areas that are represented in multiple categories, but for different aspects. For instance, consider information technology. Every institution has an approach to technology strategy, whether it be bleeding edge, leading edge, fast follower, etc. And that strategy has certain risk profile based on the level of proven versus emerging technology it employs. These risks are evaluated based on the accuracy and strength of the underlying assumptions about that strategy and whether it ultimately supports the needs of the institution. At the same time, IT has notable operational processes such as change control, user provisioning, etc. These are represented by specific processes and associated internal controls. Similarly, for information security, the program is represented at a governance level relative to program design, along with a variety of relational operational processes and their related controls. The program itself risks criticism at a strategic level as being insufficient, and operationally on a day-to-day basis based on both external events, hacks, etc., and internal threats. For each of these areas, we just need to distinguish whether a given risk is based on a functional design or an operational process to determine the appropriate category. So by adopting these primary categories, strategy, governance, external, and operational, dramatically simplifies the first level of categorizing and assessing risk, which allows us to come to more immediate conclusions and potential action plans. Should we encounter an event which impacts the institution, the first question you would always want to ask is, was this due to a design flaw, bad assumptions, an external influence of some kind, or an execution error? From an evaluation and improvement standpoint, this is infinitely more useful and actionable than was this a credit risk or an operational risk, a functionally useless question. And once again, and importantly, it keeps this in the language of the business, in that every business person intuitively understands these distinctions. Now, the mechanics of how we actually assess these in quantified terms we'll actually be covering in upcoming videos in great detail. Now, I've been really hard on risk types, but that doesn't mean they don't play an important role in our program. They do, but in a different way. So if we aren't going to use primary risk types as categories in which to classify or define risks, say risk taxonomy, then how do we use them? Simply put, risk types are not and never should have been categories. They represent characteristics. They tell us something about the scope and nature of a risk, but almost nothing about its source. This is a profoundly important distinction because it fundamentally changes how we leverage them within the risk framework. We simply flip the structure. Instead of starting with a risk category and then considering risk scenarios, we start with the risk scenarios and then we use the risk types as lenses through which we can better understand or fully evaluate risks. With each lens we look through, we may learn something new about a risk, and in the aggregate, we get a much richer understanding of them. So let's consider an example. For instance, for a loan origination team, we would never ever want to start with, what are your credit risks, your compliance risks, your operational risks, your reputation risks, etc. No, 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 no. This is confusing and will only result in eye rolls from the business line. They may be able to stumble around with some answers. It tends to only lead to confusion and frustration because the business simply doesn't work that way and people don't think that way. The team just makes loans. Rather, we should simply ask, what scenario could lead to the origination of bad loans? What else could go wrong with your processes? This uses native business language, and it's easily supported by further analysis using our primary dimensions. Which of these scenarios could we attribute to a bad credit policy or underwriting standards, bad design, or a change in the overall economic environment, an external influence, or processes that failed to catch loans being originated outside of policy, operational? And once we've got a general scenario, we can now bring in our risk types as additional lenses that may give us an even richer understanding of the potential impact of these scenarios. For instance, strategic risk, probably limited unless this is done at scale. Credit risk, yes, potentially significant. Interest rate risk, some, but really more from a portfolio perspective. Liquidity risk, little to none. Operational risk, particularly if at scale. Regulatory compliance, possible if at scale or a pattern of occurrence, particularly involving consumer lending. And reputation, possible if leading to material losses or regulatory scrutiny or sanctions. The business understands the implications of the root scenario, bad loans. This is their job. But at times in a myopic way. Potential credit losses are obvious, but what may be less obvious are some of the ripple implications of various event types. By layering in these risk tools, including considering how this risk could originate and the collective impact dimensions using our risk types, we come to a much more complete and objective perspective on the risk itself, but still in a way that the business understands. Again, all this is going to be covered in much more detail in our section on risk assessments, including a lot of very specific examples. Now, to be clear, I am in no way suggesting that we don't ever ask the question, what is our credit risk profile, or liquidity risk, or interest rate risk? These are very important questions and should be part of our analytic capability stack. But the answers should be derived from our risk management tools, analysis, and process, not as a starting place. This also doesn't suggest that larger organizations wouldn't have risk staff dedicated to certain types of risk. These roles can be valuable and important. But each of these needs to understand that they don't ever operate in isolation. If they do, that's a much larger problem. They are one component of a complex, nuanced machine, and the risks they represent are inextricably woven amongst many other types of risk that are part of a cohesive whole. Now, I fully appreciate that for some institutions, this may suggest abandoning a structure using risk types as core dimensions that has been long held orthodoxy for many and is central to many GRC solutions. But for the reasons I've discussed, it's inherently flawed in almost every way and is far too disconnected from the practicality of the business to ever be a useful approach. In short, it's past time for a new approach. So to round out this video, we're going to talk briefly about each of the major program components: risk appetite, risk assessments, and monitoring and reporting. For these, we're going to cover some high-level design concepts, and then we'll go much deeper in each of the upcoming videos. Creating a sound risk appetite framework isn't conceptually difficult, but does seem to remain one area of some confusion for many institutions. Once again, we do lack from defined standards, so each institution is kind of left to decide what this will look like within their own program. This is unfortunate because risk appetite statements and metrics are one of the three pillars of our metaphorical three-legged stool and one of the true critical guardrails. Again, risk management is not about eliminating risk, it's about optimizing to the right level. But if we've never truly defined what right is, how can we ever know if we are there? And thumb in the air approaches are never a good idea. The basic concept of acceptable risk levels is relatively easy to grasp, and most executives and board members get this pretty intuitively. It's not a big leap to articulate something like, we are a very conservative organization and don't want to be in any business lines that could lead to significant losses, generally a low or very low risk appetite level. Or we are generally conservative, but we've chosen to enter into several new or emerging segments that may represent some risk in the short term. This is maybe thought of as more low to moderate or moderate appetite. While these are fine at a high level, they're a long way from something that can be easily translated into the business units in a practical way. To do that, we need to have a framework that's robust, comprehensive, scalable, and adaptable. The key question that we have to address is, outside of high-level generalized risk philosophy, what will be the dimensions to which we will ground our risk appetite statements and metrics? Now, risk appetite can be applied to any dimension: business lines, products, risk types, physical locations, etc. And in some way they should be. However, we have to establish a baseline set of standards as a starting point. Now, if we step back to think about our primary dimensions that we established earlier, strategy, external influences, and operations, these are very helpful in relation to risk segmenting and quantification. However, they're regrettably too high level for risk appetite. Defining a tolerance for operations on the whole just simply wouldn't be meaningful. So, in order for us to have meaning, we have to drop down to the next level, which brings us back to our risk types. For better or worse, these really are a good place to begin a discussion around risk appetite, and now is an appropriate application of risk types, one more way that we can use them. Because while they aren't good at representations of how we manage the business on a day-to-day basis, people can relate to the idea of risk-taking across these dimensions, and it's an excellent way to layer more risk language into the conversation. So this is a good place to ground our risk appetite framework, both in terms of qualitative appetite statements. We have a low to moderate appetite for credit risk, a moderate appetite for operational risks, and the related metrics. Then, in support of these risk appetite statements, the other side involves the means by which we dial in our specific tolerance thresholds. This is done through the metrics that we use, and more specifically, the thresholds and triggers that ultimately translate risk appetite into practical, meaningful risk measures. In one of the next videos, I'll cover in great detail how we tease out and document risk appetite in a quantitative way, more than just high, medium, low, and then determine the appropriate monitoring metrics, and then connect the dots between risk appetite and risk assessments, reporting, etc. We can and should apply these same principles to establishing clear risk thresholds for other aspects of the business, such as those mentioned earlier, business lines, products, etc., as soon as possible. Not only can we define acceptable levels of risk, but each of these other dimensions can be assessed to determine if they're in line with the guardrails, strategy and risk appetite, and provide practical feedback to business units in support of ongoing decision making. But first, we have to get the framework right. Now, when it comes to reimagined or next generation enterprise risk management, there may be no area more in need of enhancement than when it comes to risk assessments. This means structure, approach, methodology, process, and purpose. Now, upcoming is going to be a whole series of videos dedicated to the enterprise risk assessment in great detail. But there are some fundamental ways that we need to look at how we use this tool and how we optimize it for the business. One of the biggest benefits of moving our program away from primary dimensions being all the individual risk types is in how it simplifies and clarifies our assessments, and frankly yields more meaningful results. An enterprise risk assessment built on the three core dimensions of strategy, external influences and operations, means it only has 3 modules. Technically only 2, since strategy and the external influences are both macro elements that are evaluated or assessed based on design assumptions. So fundamentally, we're really only asking 3 questions. What risks relate to flawed design assumptions in strategy, governance, policies, programs, etc.? What risks relate to our assumptions about the external influences and how they may affect the institution? And what risks relate to the outcome of operational processes that are designed to achieve the objectives? Business language, intuitive, simple. So while we're going to get into very granular aspects of risk assessments in our subsequent videos, let's consider a minute some basic design principles, some key aspects that really do need to be strengthened. Number 1, as I've said previously, we must be willing to look just as critically at the strength and assumptions related to our strategy and key governing programs as we do our operational processes. Areas like our strategy, the key financial risks, the economy, etc., are as much, if not more, about design assumptions as about execution, and is where the bulk of our life-ending risks reside. But we have to have the tools to be able to quantify the design aspects and then be able to look at them in relation to our risk appetite. We aren't going for 0 risk, we're going for the right level of risk. But if the tools don't give us that information, they're of little to no use for us. Number 2, the enterprise risk assessment should incorporate information from a wide variety of sources, including qualitative and quantitative analysis using internal and external data, historical experience, stress tests, scenario analysis, independent reviews, audits, self-assessments, and even business unit and subject matter expert opinion. But they have to be grounded on a foundation of known factors onto which these various inputs bring additional color. So one of the design principles that we will utilize is start from what you know that you know that you know, and then layer on top of that with all the information available. Number 3, they have to have a balance of both risk ratings and narrative. Either one in isolation gives an incomplete picture. Narratives alone are impossible to digest and interpret, and ratings alone give the reader 0 context about how they reach their conclusions. A sound risk assessment must include a balance of both, and those ratings and narratives have to align. Any inconsistencies must be resolved. When we get to risk assessment details, we'll see why these narratives are so critical to the integrity and value of the results. Number 4, a comprehensive enterprise and operational risk assessment is more often than not facilitated by the second line, risk management compliance, but it must be owned by the first line since they own the risks. It must be crystal clear that this is not risk management's assessment of the business, it is management's assessment. The second line is there to facilitate and at times be a subject matter expert, but also to challenge the assumptions, ratings, conclusions, etc. If there is any hint of, just tell us what we should put so you guys will go away, you're on the wrong road. A great litmus test for any business unit is whether, when asked, the leadership can articulate some sense of their purpose, their core processes, and their key risks. Number 5, all institution-wide risk assessments need to contain consistently defined and used nomenclature. An impact rating of high needs to be defined and mean the same thing for every person, business unit, risk assessment, and metric. This includes an enterprise and operational risk assessment as well as major sub-assessments, IT, InfoSec, compliance, etc. Any assessment which has the potential to roll up to an aggregate or enterprise level must use a consistent set of terms and definitions. Otherwise, we'll always be talking about apples and oranges. Number 6, on a similar note, we have to come to some standards around risk calculations. Now, this is a little more of an industry charge, but it still applies to every institution. Generally speaking, inherent risk is always defined as the product of the likelihood and impact, whether individually defined or implied through a singular rating. And residual risk is always based on some percentage reduction of that value based on the strength of the related risk treatments. Now, while the specifics of the math will be discussed in greater detail in an upcoming video, the concept never changes. Now, alternative approaches that I've seen in practice, such as averaging inherent risk and risk treatment, subtracting risk treatment from inherent risk, or taking the higher-lower of the two values, are generally considered mathematically unsound and simply indefensible scoring methodologies. We'll also talk about why a correct understanding of inherent risk means that residual risk can never be higher than inherent, although why in practice this really doesn't matter. Finally, not only is it critical to have a sound calculation methodology, that methodology has to be used in all of our scoring models. If I use one methodology for an enterprise risk assessment but a different one for others, say compliance or InfoSec, that data can never be aggregated unless it goes through some sort of conversion process. A far superior practice is just normalize the calculations along with the related nomenclature so the data can be combined. And finally, number 7, as I mentioned earlier, there has to be a so what at the end. If at the end of an exercise there were no takeaways or action items, then it's very unlikely that the job is done. While it is theoretically possible that every conceivable risk has been identified and is being managed to acceptable tolerance levels, that nothing could be improved or adjusted, the likelihood of this is almost statistically impossible. What's more likely is that not enough rocks were turned over or questions asked, or that more than one person didn't want to say what they thought out loud for whatever reason. Fortunately, as we go through conducting assessments in detail, we'll talk about ways to create dialogue and discovery in ways that are more depersonalized and really do support open, transparent discussion. Now, thinking about all these principles, if we're serious about ERM having a meaningful impact on the business and supporting business decisions, we have to get tools like these right. Otherwise, everything that we're doing is just a compliance and documentation exercise. The final element of our ERM framework involves the approach to risk monitoring and reporting, another area that continues to be a source of tremendous frustration and dissatisfaction. Just a general sense that we're not getting the information we need or have any confidence that we haven't missed anything. But I find that this is almost always because people don't understand the general design principles of metrics and how to use them effectively. Now, the good news here is, as with risk assessments, once we build our structure around the primary dimensions of design, external influences, and operations, this actually makes the process of fine-tuning risk metrics quite a bit easier and results in metrics that are meaningful, actionable, and much more forward-looking. For strategy governance and the external influence risks, metrics can be directly tied to the related design assumptions, which is generally pretty easy since most of these tend to prove out over time. For operational risks, metrics can be connected to the related operational and control processes. This approach eliminates a great deal of the ambiguity that makes many metrics little more than abstract or anecdotal indicators, virtually impossible to interpret or act on. Now, this doesn't mean that we aren't going to consider all of other risk types. We will, but again, as lenses, not dimensions. More about understanding, less about categorizing. So when approaching reporting, we can use this same framework to report on risk levels, either broadly, enterprise, or at any level of granularity we choose. This could be by business unit, product, location, etc. Regardless, the questions never change. How do we feel about the design or approach, the various external influences, and the related operational processes? The key point is that we need to start with a sound approach to measuring and monitoring the things that matter, eliminating any metric that may be measurable but simply tells us nothing about potential future events. We'll also look at how we document metrics, define tolerance and action thresholds, and then incorporate them into actionable reporting that, done correctly, should support better decision making. We'll also go further. We'll break down things like the distinction between KPIs, KRIs, KCIs, metric scope, and the dreaded forward versus backward looking, limits, thresholds, all of that. The key factor is in understanding what we're monitoring and why, and how each metric correlates to key risks. So to summarize, the above elements represent some design aspects of the major components of the ERM framework. There are more technical framework components, but these will be covered as we go along in the appropriate sections. But to summarize these framework characteristics so far, they include a dynamic risk management life cycle of perpetual evaluation and enhancement, built on a 3 lines governance model, grounded in the primary risk dimensions of design, external influences, and operational execution. A risk appetite structure for articulating acceptable risk levels in a way that can be integrated into the business and incorporated into things like risk assessments and management board reporting. Integrated, standardized, enterprise and operational risk assessments built on those core dimensions, but that utilize risk types as additional lenses for evaluation and understanding, and defining and utilizing monitoring metrics that highly correlate to key risks and assumptions. So going back to our original question, are we doing it all wrong? I don't know, maybe. I do believe that risk practitioners are sincerely trying to build programs that lead to value creation. But in order to get there, I do think it's time for a serious rethinking of a number of methods and approaches. In the next video, we're going to go deeper into the risk appetite framework, followed by a whole series of videos breaking down risk assessments in very practical ways. As always, feel free to leave a comment below. I'm a firm believer that we are smarter than me, so I always welcome new thoughts or ideas. And don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons, as well as the notification bell, so you'll be notified when new videos are available. Financial service industry for over 30 years. For these, we're going to go elements that may be academically, hammers, screwdrivers, paintbrushes. It's a new area, but we're into this. The captain of the Titanic, good Lord. They're intended to incorporate those macro risks. We need to ensure that our frameworks aren't adapted at revisiting assessments anytime that establish about mature risk management. What are the risks? All institutions